Hello, everyone, and welcome today to a very special live panel. Today, we're going to be talking about reflections on what has taken place recently with the vote to Parliament. And today, we have two special guests who will be reflecting on some of the issues that have come out, what was not spoken, and we have a list of detailed questions in which they will be responding. But before we begin my introduction of the two esteemed guest speakers, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge that I am hosting and recording this seminar from the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woi, Wurrung and Burrungongs people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we are all meeting today, work, studying, and thriving, and that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait people who are watching this presentation are also acknowledged. I would also like to acknowledge to everyone that within these lands that which we are all meeting today virtually, there is a history that is for over 40,000 years. I am now going to introduce our esteemed speakers. We have Professor Barry Judd, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous and Professor of Indigenous Studies in the School of Culture and Communications at the University of Melbourne. In his role as Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Judd has the responsibility for institutional policies, strategy, and advice in relation to all aspects of Indigenous higher education. Professor Judd holds a Master of Arts in Public Policy and a PhD in Australian Indigenous Studies, and holds postgraduate qualifications in higher education, teaching and learning. His areas of research expertise relates to Australian race relations in Australian sports and interdisciplinary research methods in Indigenous studies and Australian history. We also have today our wonderful dear professor, Professor Andrew Gunstone. Hope I pronounced that right. And Professor Andrew Gunstone is the inaugural Associate Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Reconciliation and Professor, Indigenous Studies at Federation University. He has institution-wide responsibility for all reconciliation matters. He established the National Centre for Reconciliation, Truth and Justice in February 2023. Andrew is an international expert in academic, industry, and community engagements and understanding of reconciliation, and regularly provides advice to industries, community, corporates, academia, and governments. He is the co-chair of the Board of Directors at Reconciliation Victoria and foundation editor of the Journal of Australian Indigenous Issues, and co-convener of the National University Reconciliation Action Plan Network. Thank you both for spending some time with us today with the Australian Sociological Association.
No problem, Ricky. Good to be back and interviewed by you again.
Same here, Ricky. Great to be back. Yeah.
Thank you. So we begin today. We've got a list of 11 core questions, and we may extend it to a few more, and with a Q&A list of questions that have been sent. So the first question that I'll start off with to Professor Barry Judd. What were the main reasons for the failure of the Voice to Parliament proposal to be enshrined in the Australian Constitution?
Thank you for that question. It's not an easy one to answer. I think the short answer is I think there were multiple reasons why the referendum failed to pass, and I think the one that stands out for me, at least, is the import of Trumpian-style politics and the spreading of misinformation and disinformation through the Australian media. And I think, for me, I guess we can accept that politicians lie as part of their job, position descriptions. But what we can't accept is a media that doesn't filter information, that doesn't fact check information, and that doesn't hold politicians to account for their words. And I think one of the key reasons the referendum failed was, and excuse my language, the airwaves and the internet became clogged up with shit. And it made it very difficult for average Australians who had to vote in this referendum to find any information that was actually based in the truth and in evidence. And I think that shitstorm, if I can call it that, of misinformation, disinformation, was the thing that more than any other factor lost the vote.
Professor Andrew Gunstone.
Yeah, I completely agree with Barry there. I think the overwhelming misinformation and lies from the No campaign really did muddy the waters. I think the other thing I'd just really like to add is that racism also played a really big factor in this result as well. It was quite upsetting to see after the referendum, not only did the No advocates deny the existence of racism, but a number of media commentators, which goes to Barry's point about the poor quality of media analysis in the campaign. It continued after the result. A number of prominent media commentators said it had nothing to do with racism, when in fact it had so much to do with racism. There were so many examples from friends and colleagues who were attacked viciously on social media, attacked in public. Professor Marcia Langton, who Barry works closely with and is an absolute hero of mine, was attacked for daring to call out racism during the campaign. It was absolutely appalling. And I've written recently on this and brought up some of my longitudinal research I've been doing for the past 20 years, which is the longest longitudinal study in Australia on attitudes towards reconciliation amongst non-Indigenous peoples, and just highlighted some of those long-standing results that indicate such significant levels of racism towards reconciliation towards Indigenous peoples amongst non-Indigenous Australians. So racism was very prominent throughout the campaign. I had colleagues of mine, senior multicultural leaders, talking about how No campaigners were contacting members of the multicultural community, saying that they would be deported from Australia, they would lose their land, they would be tax extra charges if the yes case got up. So the lies, the misinformation, exactly as Barry said, that just added to a lot of confusion. And in general, the Australian public is very ignorant of just in general how a referendum works. I think it was a significant percentage of Australians didn't even know we had a referendum. So when you add all that to it, the actual vicious lies and the racism, it confused a lot of people. And what seemed at the start to be a really straightforward proposition, a simple but profound change to the Australian Constitution, which again was about recognising and listening to Indigenous peoples. What should have been a really straightforward process was destroyed by politics, which is really devastating.
I think the other thing, if I can add, is the really effective advocates for No, the most effective happen to be two very prominent Aboriginal people, and I think that really hurt too, because unlike the plebiscite around same-sex marriage, in that situation, you didn't have high-profile gay and lesbian people coming out saying vote no. But in this case, we did have that, and I think my reading would be that Jacinta Price was probably the most effective politician and advocate for No in the whole campaign, probably because she feeds into actually what are racist narratives about who Indigenous people are, because she represents the Northern Territory.
And I think both,
and it's important to point out. Sorry, Ricky. I agree with Barry. Important to point out, though, of course, that the electorate that she represents, every single Indigenous organisation, that electorate strongly came out to support the voice. So Barry is exactly right. It fed into racist views from non-Indigenous peoples, which were completely incorrect anyhow.
and this sort of leads to our next question, which hopefully both of you be able to really unpack for us. And it's, how did the political and public discourse surrounding the Voice to Parliament proposal impact its chances of success? Professor Barry Judd?
Well, significantly. You know, I've been thinking about the referendum and its failure ever since it happened, and quite a number of things have crossed my mind, and no one's ever said this, but I've been thinking it. Why did we name the mechanism to Parliament the Voice, which to many Australians it probably references a show on TV, does it not? So, you know, you've got an immediate marketing and communications issue there with the name of the thing. I think one of the turning points, though, was the withdrawal of bipartisan support. And again, as Andrew's kind of said, many people in the Australian public don't know our political system real well, or don't follow politics closely. They're much more interested in sporting codes of one kind or the other, or something else. Not many people would realise that it was the Liberal Party that really supported the process which led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the idea of voice to some extent. And I think the withdrawal of their support and the reframing of the referendum as the Labor Party's referendum or the Prime Minister's referendum really had a significant impact, because it kind of eliminated or made invisible all the Indigenous activists and academics and thinkers who had over many years designed the voice mechanism. And, you know, we know that Tom Calma and Marcia Langton put together for government a very, very detailed explanation of what the voice was and how they thought it would work, and the kinds of positive impacts that it would make for Australian politics and society. All of that was lost because it just became, I guess, a dress rehearsal for the next federal election. And Darton and Littleproud made it into that. Instead of a referendum about the future of Australia, it became, I want to be Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister at the next federal election. And this is a free hit, and we're going to hit the PM.
Yeah.
Professor Andrew Gunstone?
Absolutely. I'd go further to say I think Dunn's motivation was just to stay opposition leader, because a lot of people forget this, but the week he came out to oppose the Voice was 3 days or 4 days after the by-election, which was the first time in 120 years that an opposition party had lost its seat to an incumbent government, and that was the election in Melbourne, in one of the outer suburb seats. And so there was a lot of pressure on him at that stage for his leadership. My understanding from what I've heard is that there was a strong support within the Liberal caucus to support the Voice, but Dutton got his way to oppose it, and therefore all discussion about his leadership and his poor results at that time got lost in the discussion about the Voice support as well. So I think it was a very political ploy to keep him in his own leadership role. And it's important to note we've had 45 referendums in Australian history. only 8 have succeeded, and of those 8, they've all been succeeded because of strong bipartisan support. So that's a really important point to note. Sorry, one of my kids has just come home from school. I'm going to have to open the door. Can I just 2 seconds? Sorry.
Absolutely, this is all live, Phil. I just wanted to ask you this, Professor Barry Judd, and it sort of segues a little bit from the question I wanted to ask, because I want to explore it quickly now with you. There was a lot of talk, and you mentioned something about the voice and using the concept of the voice. And I remember that they then used John Farman's song, The Voice. Can you perhaps unpack that a little bit? Because I think, yeah, you mentioned a really interesting point that no one's really put out as a discussion paper yet about the impact of that language. Can you perhaps explore that for everyone listening? Perhaps in reflection, what should we have thought about? Should we have really used things like the Voice and John Farman and segue away to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's my personal opinion. I haven't, set up a research project around this question, but it just seems to me that several of my friends and colleagues have said, why call it The Voice? It's confusing. We're not quite sure what it means. Don't Indigenous people already have voices? And quite a few of the more considered responses to that have been, the problem is not necessarily an Indigenous voice, it's the fact that governments don't listen to that voice. So I just think it's interesting that perhaps the use of that term explains in part why it never actually cut through with voters as a concept. I don't know why simply language about an advisory mechanism to government wasn't used. I mean, that's what it is after all, but we don't set up committees in organisations and call them voices. We call them working groups or advisory groups or subcommittees or something. So anyway, I think it is interesting, and that was a fairly consistent piece of feedback from people I know about why use this word, the voice, to try and convey what Indigenous people need.
Professor, yeah, I was going to ask you, Professor Gunstone, did you have a point to add to Barry or a differing view on this?
Yeah, apologies about before. Just one of my kids came home from the exam. So yeah, I suppose, and back to sort of what I was also saying before. I think part of the issue is just the incredibly poor education that the average Australian has about Indigenous issues. And Barry wrote a wonderful piece in a journal special issue a few months ago about the education system, and I think it was a really apt point that Barry made, because it was really hard to, within the space of a few months, try to convince Australians to vote for this, particularly without bipartisan support. As I was just saying before, that no referendum's ever been won without bipartisan support, but to try to educate Australians. I think, look, I mean, we could have used different language, and I accept all that, but I think whatever language was used, whatever scope was happening, whatever type of constitutional reform we're going to do, there was always going to be strong opposition to it. And I think the No campaign, very disappointingly, was very successful in muddying the waters. And back, what we were saying earlier about just confusing people and using outright lies to muddy the waters. I think that was always going to happen. And it was very disappointing the Nationals came out, as well as the Liberals later on came out against it. The Nationals came out so far early on before any proposed discussions had been had. And that was, again, going to Barry's point, very much led by Jacinta Price. And that sort of opposition for the sake of it, and to turn into as Barry said, a Trumpian sort of analysis of just opposing for the sake of it, was really disappointing. And the other point I'd just like to make about Peter Dutton, he was on the wrong side of history 15 years ago when he's the only opposition frontbencher to refuse to apologise to the stolen generation. And he acknowledged later that he was on the wrong side of history with that. Well, it's clear already now, but it'll be clearer in the upcoming years. He was on the wrong side of history of this as well.
And sorry, Professor Barry Judd, I think I interrupted you. Did you want to add part to that?
Oh, no, I was just going to, I'm in so many online meetings with Andrew, it becomes this kind of, off-script conversation between the two of us. It's fine. Continue on, Ricky.
Okay. This is a kind of a curly question, but I feel that's an important one to ask. Were there any specific legal or constitutional complexities that pose significant barriers to the successful implementation of the voice to Parliament? Professor Judd.
Well, I don't think so. And, the country's leading constitutional lawyers and specialists, so not people who have thought about this for 5 seconds and then sent a Facebook post or something on X or Twitter or whatever it's called. These people who have made the Constitution their life's work, they almost all said that this proposal was extremely low risk, and that it would not mean that a raft of cases go to the High Court for determination. There would be some, but there are some now. So I think in the political sphere, though, it was the fear or the idea, which I can't remember who first said this, whether it was Turnbull or Barnaby Joyce or both of them together in the bathtub. But someone came up with the suggestion that a voice to Parliament would be a third chamber of the Parliament and would sit beside the Senate as another kind of house of review. And I think that was something that people used as an out, a reason to vote no, according to some kind of bent, distorted legal narrative. And the other one, I think, was whether advice would be given solely to the Parliament or the Parliament and executive government. And I think again, according to the constitutional lawyers and experts, extremely low risk or no risk. But again, that gave the opposition parties opportunity to seemingly run a non-racist narrative about why people should vote no. And there were many reasons out there, as I've said, in the media shitstorm that emerged. Not all of them were racist. And I think these legal ones probably paired off people who might have voted yes to the no side.
Professor Andrew Gunstone?
Yeah, I mean, there was a parliamentary inquiry earlier this year with hundreds of submissions to it. And I went through and reviewed those submissions, and overwhelmingly, nearly every one of the submissions from constitutional law experts, from academic legal experts, from academic organisations, from legal firms, almost universally, they all said it was constitutionally sound. And that was their way of saying it's completely legal what's being done. As Barry said, it would be very low risk or no risk at all in terms of high court errors. So that was a really important point that was made. But as Barry said, that didn't stop the politics of it. So a good example is one of the many lies that the No case put out was that it's not really about an advisory body, because in the actual constitutional amendment, it never says anything about advice. And so therefore it can't be an advisory body. Whereas the constitutional law experts explained, and I'm not a law person at all, but I understood from what the experts were saying, in the terms of the Constitution, when you use the word advice, it's actually under constitutional law, it's actually saying this is something that must be taken. So if you give advice to the Governor-General, the Governor-General must take it. So under that context, if you use the word advice, it's not advice that we normally know it. So what the mischievous opponents of the voice did is they took that basic constitutional premise and flipped it to try to explain to people who aren't educated about this that this actually is some sort of dodgy attempt to not put advice in the Constitution, whereas the reality was the constitutional law experts said there is, by using the word representation and the words that they use, that is actually saying they're going to get advice, and that's all the voice was. So that's just one example where they just tried to twist it around to suit their political purposes. But overwhelmingly, the clear understanding from experts was that it was a completely sound project. I had the real honour of presenting at a couple of events with Professor Cheryl Saunders, one of Barry's colleagues at University of Melbourne, and he's one of the leading constitutional law experts in the world, not just Australia, but in the world. And anyone who'd gone to listen to her speak would have been quite put at ease about what the constitutional soundness of the voice was. But it really, as we talked about, Ricky, it moved from any sort of legal analysis to a political discussion. And when you had opposition parties just playing point scoring with it, that's where it was doomed. And you know, when you had some really mischievous attempts from people like Peter Dutton and others to say, oh, well, the government shouldn't have the voice to Parliament and executive, as Barry said, but just to Parliament, that's ludicrous, because anyone with any understanding of how the political process works is that it's not just Parliament just doesn't dream up legislation. The legislation has to go through various departments, through the public service. And so it would be meaningless to have had just a voice to Parliament. It had to be a voice to the executive. And remember, it was just a non-binding voice. And if people thought that if Albanese had compromised, could have got through, I don't agree with that at all. I think no matter what Albanese did, they would have found ways to disagree. So there was always going to be opposition to the voice. And the example of where Peter Dutton, just before the referendum, mischievously said that he'd have another referendum on just representing Indigenous people in the Constitution. Well, the Liberal Party had 9 years in government, and they never actually enacted legislation for that or a referendum legislation. And conveniently, as soon as the referendum was lost, Peter Dutton suddenly forgot to talk about that issue. So it was all political games, which is just so disappointing, because it's just played with so many people's lives and is an exact reason why we needed the voice in the first place. Because, you know, for 60 years since the 67 referendum, both Labor and Liberal have played political football with Aboriginal people's lives, and that was the reason the voice was so needed to be enshrined in the Constitution. And if you didn't need any more evidence to show why it was needed, the referendum was the actual campaign itself was a reason why we needed the voice.
I wanted to now explore this a little bit further, because when we talk about the impact of the major political parties using this as a mechanism for their own political agenda, as opposed to the well-being and understanding of what has happened in the past, I want to ask you now a very important question. What role did public opinion and societal attitudes play in shaping the fate of the Voice to Parliament proposal? Professor Barry Judd? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think I got that question.
Do you want me to repeat that?
Yeah,
I'm happy to repeat. And I think it's one that we can reflect deeply when we think about what role, after hearing about, we knew about the politics and the leaders and sort of taking the stance that they did, what role did public opinion as a result and societal attitudes play in shaping the fate of the Voice to Parliament proposal?
Thank you. I'm not sure whether it's just my end, but you are freezing up from time to time, Ricky. So thanks for repeating the question. Andrew referred to a paper I wrote for a journal that he amazingly put out in a number of weeks prior to the referendum day. And in that paper, I talked about the failure of the Australian education system from the time of the Hawke and Keating governments and those governments setting in place reconciliation as a national movement and framework. And what I was trying to say in that paper is that I think while reconciliation has been somewhat of a success as a framing concept and allows non-Indigenous Australians to think about progressing race relations and building a better society through those terms. One of the key failings has been the education systems of Australia, and reconciliation, as I understand it, was a process set in place as step one to possible treaty negotiations, which Prime Minister Hawke had attempted in 1988 and had run up against significant and unfair opposition from mining companies and other entrenched interests. So one of the kind of ideas behind reconciliation as a way of framing Indigenous affairs, or whatever you want to call it, was that it would give national governments breathing space. They would direct their energies into better educating the public about the history of Australian race relations and colonialism and the impact intergenerational on Indigenous people, the continued consequences of that history for all of us. And that really, as I say in my paper, didn't happen. We continue to have most school leavers in Australia leaving school at year 12 with next to nothing in terms of their knowledge and understanding of their own history and the history of Indigenous peoples on this continent. And that's really frustrating. I continue, and I'm sure Andrew's the same, we continue to get undergraduate students into our Indigenous studies classes at university level who might live in suburbs called Toorak or towns called Ballarat, right? So places with Aboriginal names, and they don't even know that. They know nothing. They claim to have never met an Aboriginal person, thought about Aboriginal people or issues, or engaged with the place as a place where Aboriginal people have lived for 50 to 65,000 years. So I think ignorance played a huge role in the way the vote went, and I think latent racism also played a significant role, because ignorance is a good place to start for racism and racist ideas, and it's a place where any kind of difference becomes something to hang fear off, actually. So a lot of what I saw in the No campaign was based on fear, as Andrew said, that people in the Chinese community or whatever in Melbourne were being told that they'd be deported, and their houses, which they've spent years buying in suburban Melbourne, would be taken off them. Just completely untrue. But those ideas gain traction because our education system continues to fail us, all of us. And in the absence of good information and a good education, racism takes hold, and politicians are able to play on people's own lack of understanding and insight and their fears about what this means for them.
Professor Andrew Gunstone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my kids have just almost finished their schooling system, and I'm just so disappointed that they really haven't learned a lot much more than I did at school all those decades ago. So there really hasn't been as big an advance in the education systems in engaging with Indigenous knowledges that many of us would have been hoping for. So the education in this country is just appalling. I'll give you a specific example. So this longitudinal survey that I mentioned I've been doing since 2005, there's a couple of questions there about Indigenous socioeconomic disadvantage in areas such as health, housing and employment. And this relates very much to the referendum, because one of the main arguments that many of us were making about the referendum was that, we've had decades of policy failure in addressing health and education because we've often had non-Indigenous bureaucrats making decisions without advice from Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities. And that was one of the main rationales of the Voice, was to ensure that Indigenous peoples were consulted about issues that related to them and their communities' experiences. Yet this survey that I've been doing since 2005 conclusively shows between 35 and 40% of the non-Indigenous respondents didn't even believe Indigenous disadvantage existed in areas such as health and housing. Quite a high percentage thought that Indigenous peoples had higher levels of housing, employment and health than non-Indigenous peoples, and didn't even understand, many decades of evidence through Closing the Gap reports about some of these overall levels of disadvantage. So that's just an example where that ignorance about such a basic fact, that's going to then obviously directly impact upon whether those people choose to vote yes in a referendum if they don't even understand the rationale. And like Barry, I think there's obviously ignorance then provides a strong ground for racism. So in this recent report I wrote, I strongly argue that that lack of ignorance, that lack of understanding about an issue that's so relevant and so highly reported on, is an example of the racism in this country, because people are choosing to be ignorant. You can't possibly say we're still living under what W.H. Stanner said, years ago was silence. That doesn't exist anymore. There's a lot of evidence out there. So education plays a massive role. And in terms of some of the racist views, I mean, the attacks on people, the attacks during the campaign against the Voice to say people would lose their land. I spoke at dozens and dozens of events across Australia, and everywhere I went, I'd often have questions asking about, well, will I lose my land? Particularly when I was speaking at a lot of events in rural Australia, people were always asking if they were going to lose their land. And this is the playbook that happened 30 years ago in the Mabo native title debates, where you'd have these racist attacks on native title to say people are going to lose their land. And in the 30 years since, not 1 square centimetre of freehold title has been returned to Indigenous peoples because it can't under native title. But that didn't stop those racist arguments being happening again, and they've been trotted out again for the 2023 referendum. So that level of ignorance and racism is really significant. The other thing, Rick, if I might add, that I've written a bit about recently as well, is I think really highlighted the narrow understandings amongst so many non-Indigenous peoples about issues of equity. And so I think Aristotle sort of paraphrased Aristotle in the paper recently that, inequality doesn't just result from people in equal circumstances being treated unequally, which is a part we all understand, but inequality also results from people in unequal circumstances being treated equally. And to me, that illustrates the difference between the 1967 referendum, where 90% of Australians supported the referendum because that removed 2 racist sections of the Constitution, which didn't count Indigenous people in the census and didn't enable the federal government to pass laws for Indigenous peoples. Most non-Indigenous Australians understood they were completely racist and they took those sections out. Then marriage equality plebiscite, most Australians supported that because that was giving LGBTIQ peoples a right to have same-sex marriages, a right that other Australians had. But this one was too easily played by the Conservative opponents to say, why do Indigenous people get a voice and no one else gets a voice? And that played into that very shallow understanding that many non-Indigenous peoples have about inequality. And they didn't understand that we're talking here about Indigenous peoples who've lived on this continent for over 65,000 years, 1,200 generations, as opposed to the most non-Indigenous people who lived here is up to 10 generations, the absolute most. That in itself illustrates why policies need to be different. So that really fundamental ignorance about inequality, I think, played a big factor in this campaign's results as well.
I just wanted to now ask quickly, and this is one of my areas, and I really want to, and I know we'll have to organise the time to do another whole podcast on this, but one of the issues as a past teacher, I felt that and I know the pressure of curriculum and pre-service teaching is important, but the lack of time spent on Indigenous relations and history was quite appalling. And I did my pre-service training. I did the 4-year course 10, 12 years ago. And all there was just a 1 unit that covered for primary and secondary. And then there was told like threads. And I just wanted to ask both of you, because you're both heads in universities, and I know we don't have much time, we're going to divert, but to me it plays into this whole notion. You've got teachers, and now we're pushing, free, we're giving people scholarships to study teaching next year. Is there scope with restructure to ensure that the teachers coming out have a deep understanding of the issues? Because I get concerned in the sector with primary school that you do humanities, you do 1 unit and you can teach Indigenous studies. But sometimes, and I've spoken to teachers and they say, I don't feel confident, and they tend to be prescriptive and non-reflective and have limited scope. And I just wanted to quickly, because this sort of taps into this misinformation and not knowing about history, and as you said, the thousands of years culture and history. Professor Barry Judd, do we need to also consider ensuring that our future teachers have a deeper understanding of Indigenous ways of knowing to bring into the classroom?
The short answer is yes. I do think that I do think the attitude that I'm not equipped to teach this is a significant blockage to where we are in the education system. And one of my colleagues, Professor Melita Hogarth over in the Faculty of Education, is running a project that is all about building a toolbox for teachers out there in the real world, so that they can equip themselves with the necessary materials to feel confident to teach about Indigenous people issues, history in the classroom. So I think that's part of the solution, but I also think that no matter how much time you spend in the classroom in lecture theatres learning about Indigenous matters, it never beats in the field experience, so to speak. And so a complementary part of the work needs to be ensuring that people studying education as a tertiary program are enabled to spend some time in Indigenous communities, finding out the realities of what those communities are and how they operate, and all the challenges that they have in the education space. And I think, that's kind of a not a mass way of teaching people, but I think it is highly complementary to other work. And in remote communities, that they need people with some kind of background experience to go into those places and teach and stay for a significant amount of time. At the moment in the Northern Territory, I think the average stay for a remote area teacher is something like 6 to 8 months, and that needs to be taken out to 3, 4, 5 years.
Thank you.
So, it's a range of things that need to happen.
Professor Andrew Gunstone, if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I completely agree that the teach for training is a really key factor. Ricky, you said you had one unit. My wife had even less experience than that. When she did her teacher training many years ago, the university she was at put all these had one unit, and each week had one different section. So there's one week on Indigenous education, not 1 week to cover 230 years since the invasion. And the lecturer actually accidentally put that on a public holiday, so that week was cancelled. So her entire 4-year degree, she got nothing on that. So look, clearly, now hopefully things are a little bit better now, but there's still too many, I think, universities who are doing Indigenous education training that aren't doing it in a good way. Some universities don't even employ Indigenous academics in these education courses. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I think the other thing to remember is I think a lot of non-Indigenous people use that as an excuse as well. And in today's society, when there's got so much engagement with Indigenous media and Indigenous resources by lots of Indigenous authors, there's ways people can find out themselves. And I think the campaign really exemplified that as well. I had to send a couple of all staff emails out during the campaign to staff at the university, and I'm aware of this happening elsewhere as well, that many non-Indigenous people, with the best of intentions, were just haranguing Indigenous staff to say, what should I do? And so you'd have someone who's just going to the cafeteria to get lunch and have to deal with 5 non-Indigenous people on the way saying, oh, how do I vote? What do I do here? And so the cultural load for Indigenous staff in organisations, which is already totally inappropriately high, was even exemplified even higher during the referendum because of the load people had. So most organisations, I know Barry's did, mine did as well, put really comprehensive resources on the web to try to educate non-Indigenous people about the referendum. So to me, yes, education systems need to improve, absolutely, but there also needs to be an understanding from non-Indigenous Australians that they have to take responsibility for this themselves and to learn this engagement themselves and not to use excuses. And I think that was exemplified in the referendum campaign.
We're now coming to a question that is really, I guess it's almost, for me, it sits sort of almost in my throat, because I think Professor Gunstone, we had a conversation about this, or it might have been Professor Judd. I'm bad with my memory, but I remember some of your words still stick with me. So this question kind of resonates from that. What lessons can be learned from the failure of the Voice to Parliament proposal, and how might these inform future efforts to address Indigenous representation and rights in Australia? Professor Barry Judd, if we could start with you with that one first.
I'm still feeling fairly negative about the result, and still thinking about what it means. Actually, it may take several years before we come to a fuller understanding of all the consequences of this, and of course, academics like us will be watching people and the moves they make over the next several years to see what all the fallout is. But I suspect for many people like me, there will be a resignation and a retreat from the idea that Australian governments can do much good for us as peoples, and there may be a retreat into, or a falling back onto institutions that exist in civil society, like football clubs, like churches, like universities, which have been part of the fabric of Indigenous communities now since the 1967 referendum, and supporters and allies of ours. I think many people will perhaps say, well, government can get stuffed, that didn't work. We're just interested in working through our local community orgs, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to get stuff done. I think that may be what happens now. And I was in a meeting yesterday with some colleagues from New Zealand, and they were kind of saying, well, when national governments turn bad in New Zealand, Maori people can always fall back on civil institutions, because it's just part of the culture now that that's where the support base often is, in places like universities and sporting clubs. And I think maybe a similar thing will happen here. That's the reassurance that I gave my staff actually on the Monday after, that the university remains absolutely committed to reconciliation and to improving outcomes for Indigenous people. And in fact, we have a responsibility to go further now, given the results, to show leadership in this space. And I suspect that the university sector, the education sector to some extent, and sports and religious groups will more or less take the same attitude. But I don't know, Andrew, this is your area of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of reconciliation, I think this campaign, I mean, this has been obvious for many years, but this should be really obvious after the campaign, is my view is performative reconciliation should be taken out and buried. And so many people and organisations engage in performative reconciliation, not substantive reconciliation. So, my strong view is reconciliation continues, but not performative reconciliation. And what I mean by that is, people who wear trendy T-shirts or have morning teas, and if that's all they do, that's not enough. Now, with the university sector, I know Barry's university, my university, many others did support the referendum, but I think up to 12 or 13 didn't, which is about a third of the whole university sector did not support the referendum. And they did that, I think, out of cowardness and out of an attempt to argue that they needed to be neutral. But Professor Megan Davis, who's one of the architects of the Uluru Statement, she, I think, talked about that really well at the University of Australia conference early this year, when she said, if you're making a decision to not take a stand, that is in itself taking a stand, because silence is political. And so I think there's a lot of organisations, universities, also a lot of RAP organisations. So Federation University has its main campuses in Ballarat. From my understanding, in Ballarat, there's a lot of organisations with RAPs. There was just us and one other organisation that was strongly supporting the voice. So I think if you're a RAP organisation or if you're a university, you're already understanding the importance of Indigenous voices in your organisation. You'll already, if you're genuinely engaging with a RAP, you'll already have advisory bodies and self-determination embedded within your organisation. So if organisations are knowing that about their own selves, they should have understood that for the country. So I think that's a really strong indictment of those RAPs, those universities, those organisations that understand the importance of self-determination not to have supported it. And I think there really needs to be a redoubling of efforts from reconciliation organisations to ensure we're driving genuine self-determination, Indigenous rights, addressing cultural safety, addressing truth-telling, and not just looking at performative reconciliation. I think that's a big lesson from the referendum itself. But I think there's a lot of lessons we need to learn that are not just because of the referendum, but I think the referendums acknowledge that Indigenous rights needs to be much more recognised. Australia signed up to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2009. We originally rejected it in 2007. We signed up in 2009. But since then, we've done really nothing ever since. Like Canada, for example, has enacted domestic legislation to enact UNDRIP at a domestic law. They've actually done audits, but we have never done an audit of our own legislation. We don't have domestic legislation. We don't have requirements for new legislation to fit into UNDRIP. If you look at some of some of the clauses in UNDRIP, Ricky, they're really important about recognising Indigenous rights. There's one clause, I think it's clause 17, that specifically talks about the importance for Indigenous peoples to be able to have a say in matters that impact them. And you could read that. I think that's effectively the referendum question. So I think engaging in international areas is important, but also from a domestic point of view, truth-telling. I think truth-telling is so critically important. Addressing history was really exemplified in this, as we talked about in this referendum. People don't know the truth-telling. But then on a positive note, I think, and we're all in Victoria. I think Victoria is a great example of where we can look at. So most states and territories, Ricky, have now implemented or are going towards the path of voice, treaty and truth in their own states and territories. So Victoria is leading the way. We have the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, which is a democratic institution for Indigenous Victorians. It's just had its second election. So that's certainly the voice part. They've worked with the Victorian government to implement the Europe Justice Commission, which is doing amazing work in truth-telling. And then the First Peoples Assembly working with the Victorian government to look at a series of local treaties and a statewide treaty, which will come up in the next couple of years. So I think that's a lot. So people are sort of thinking about how to engage. That's to get involved in the work of Europe, to get involved in the work of the First Peoples to support their work, I think is important. And other states and territories are pushing down that path as well. One of the things, though, it is very disappointing since the referendum is to look at the Conservative pushback against some of these processes. So we have had the Queensland opposition say they're not going to continue with the truth and treaty process up there. The New South Wales government's sort of cooling off a bit. So I think it's really incumbent on Victoria, because we're well underway. The Victorian government's continued its support and that's what I talked about a lot during the referendum campaign. We're already doing truth, treaty and voice in Victoria. The sky hasn't fallen in. People haven't lost their jobs. We still can get petrol for our car. The world hasn't been a disaster. So we can show in Victoria that these processes can be enacted and we can have some transformational change. So to me, going back to those state and territory approaches might be a way we need to look at for the next few years until we launch again at a national level. But I agree with Barry. It's gut wrenching the result. I mean, I think intellectually we all knew we were in trouble because of the polls, but to see it play out so viscerally on election night itself and so quickly was just shocking. And I think there's still a lot of very understandable grief out in the community about what's happening. So I think it's going to take a long time to think of next steps and progress from here.
And that kind of leads to the big question before we sort of talk about some of the Q&A questions raised and where to from here. What are the implications of the Voice to Parliament's failure for the broader reconciliation and Indigenous rights movements in Australia? Professor Barry Judd, if you could lead us into that for your response.
Oh, well, I think for Indigenous people, it's the feeling of being unrecognised and unwanted, and one of the most disappointing things, and I guess we as academics also knew this would happen, is that in the wash up and the commentaries that followed, it's just a bunch of white fellas talking to each other about their own kind of business, their own concerns, and what this meant for national politics. So I can't remember seeing anybody much on the media or in the media making Indigenous people's health and well-being central to the commentary about the referendum defeat. And I think there are many people who are struggling right now in the aftermath of this defeat, and really don't know what their place is in Australia anymore. I had the feeling in the week after that I didn't know my country anymore, that I thought I knew Australia. I thought it had made progress on these matters, but I woke up on October the 15th in a foreign land, so to speak, not knowing where I it in anymore, I guess. And I suspect many people experience that. Many people, unfortunately, have also experienced an uptick significant in racism. And that's been both online and, in person. And that I suspect is happening right across Australia in all sorts of unexpected places, including university campuses, where students and staff are being impacted. And strangely, the current conflict in the Middle East has kind of provided a continuum of racist trolling and rubbish out there in the world that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been caught up in. And even though the two things are completely different on the surface of things, they've been conflated by racists, and that's a problem. That's a real problem. So my personal experience of this is one of exhaustion. I'm pretty much in zombie phase right now, waiting for a holiday. And it's been tough dealing with on-campus incidents of racism, both around the referendum and now of this conflict, which Indigenous people, because of those two events, haven't really had a break from increased levels of non-Indigenous surveillance, intervention, and attention, negative attention. Every other week, we talked about Marcia Langton and what a warrior and leader she's been through this whole process. Every other week, Professor Langton gets death threats, or sometimes those death threats come to me. If they're not death threats, they're calls by members of the community for her to be dismissed without any process from her position at the university. So, that's the kind of craziness, I would say, that's been unleashed by the referendum. And it's concerning what comes next. Well, Jacinta Price, I think, on the night said that part of her agenda is it will be leaving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people alone for 5 minutes to go and, fight transgender people or something. So I just think the referendum has surfaced a whole lot of things that I thought had faded out in Australia, but it's come back, like herpes or something, twice as bad as it was originally. And Indigenous people have always been the canary in the room or in the mine for Australian politics. And I am worried that one consequence will be racism is out of the bottle. It'll be us today and someone else tomorrow.
Professor Andrew Gunstone.
Yeah, thanks, bro. That was such an important reflection. Completely and utterly support it. I've talked to a number of non-Indigenous senior leaders over the last few weeks to try to emphasise to them these are people who support the referendum, but for them not to say, "Okay, let's move on. We haven't succeeded," so, and it's this automatic Western idea. We've got to go to the next thing straight away, and not to grieve. I know Indigenous colleagues who've taken their children out of school because of the racism their kids are suffering. Indigenous colleague of mine had to move seats on a plane the other day because he had racist people in business suits having a go at him. So there is, like Aboriginal organisations are reporting a 50-fold increase in blocking racist people from online through Facebook. So non-Indigenous people need to understand the level of racism is extraordinary in this country. Noel Pearson talks about racism as being Australia's original sin, and it's obviously connected to dispossession and invasion. So non-Indigenous people need to understand that. You've got a pushback from the Conservatives, on welcomes to country. So there's some shocking things that are happening out there, and people, need to understand that this is a time for grieving and to stand up in allyship as well. So I completely support what you're saying, Barry, and it's disgraceful. And in regards to Professor Langton, I was just horrified during the campaign that she got attacked by Conservatives for she had the bravery to call out racism, and she was attacked for that, and the fact that there was racist comments throughout the referendum was ignored. So this country is racist, and it needs to be addressed. And I think it's incumbent on us non-Indigenous allies to stand up everywhere, no matter who is saying this, and speak truth to power, and to be genuine allies and resist as much as we can against racism. And you see it, as you say, Barry, you see it at universities all the time. The average university person wouldn't want to be compared to Pauline Hanson, but the level of racism at institutions such as universities is just shocking, and it's all the time. And it's often coming from people that have a bit of knowledge. And I think Stephen Hawking once said, the most dangerous kind of people are those that have a bit of knowledge and think they know it all. So, if you've got people that, you might have seen this too, Barry, but the amount of times you meet non-Indigenous people who've lived in New Zealand for a couple of years and come over here and say, oh, yeah, I know it all. Or they've done one cultural competency training course, and they're the people that are most resistant to being called out. And, the term white fragility is a really good term to describe those people, and they're stuff that we're fighting against all the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the issue with racism at places like universities is you're dealing with a clever population of people in the main. They do all think they know something, and they deploy racism in very nuanced ways. So we're not talking about football ground racial vilification or the stuff you might see on Yarra trams. We're talking about very subtle uses of white power to marginalize people, belittle them. That's all about reinstituting some kind of racial hierarchy and order in the world. So a good example would be a lecturer presenting on the works of Charles Darwin to a class with several Indigenous students in it in a very uncritical way. In fact, they're talking Darwin up as this great white man who should be read by everybody and celebrated. And to me, that's a form of subtle racism at work in the classroom.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that sort of leads us now to where to from here. What can people do? And I want to first ask Professor Barry Judd. Now, of course, there's a lot of people still who are grieving, and I respect that, and we need that. But I'm also thinking, what can allies do? And I'm thinking about people who participated to support us in the campaign. What things can people do, actions today, to start building back the momentum?
Oh, well, I go back to what Andrew said a few moments ago about not thinking about this in a Western way. It's not done and dusted. It's not over. And let's not forget that almost 40% of Australians backed in the Voice and wanted a better future for everybody in this country. So I think we need to work with them to get to 51% of the population sometime in the near future. I think for allies, the message would be continue to build your relationships, knowledge and understanding of Indigenous people in this country, and continue to work with us in whatever way you can to progress things to make this place a fairer, more just society, where we don't have statistics like more Aboriginal men being in prison than in universities. And I think it's just as Marcia Langton would say, you got to turn up every day. You got to do the work every single day, however small. Don't expect it to be an announceable in the way that many of those RAP plans that Andrew was referencing are, but you know, achieve every single day in a quiet way that will make real progress. And to me, real progress is having allies across society support Aboriginal people to fulfill their life opportunities, whatever they may be. So, you know, of course, education plays a huge role in enabling that, encouraging people to go to school, supporting them to hang in there and succeed, giving them opportunities to get a job. And, you know, that's when there are so many young Aboriginal men in prison and women these days, unfortunately, giving somebody a job becomes really important to break that cycle of imprisonment. So there are very practical things that can be done, and we don't need to advertise them. We just need to do them and get on with the job. And changing one person, one situation at a time for the better. It's amazing how that small gesture of support or encouragement can make a huge difference over the course of one person's lifetime, or their family's lifetime, or over generations in one family. You know, good things that people can do today will change the futures of Aboriginal families. You know, and how they experience Australia in 75 years or 100 years or 150 years. They could either be in prison or dead, snuffed out if bad things happen to them, or if allies support them and help them. You know, they may be in a situation where they have both income and wealth and have been able to, you know, buy back country through freehold and have restarted ceremonial practices with their kin. You know, that's the kind of difference that turning up every day can have, I think, if you think long term.
Professor Andrew Gunstone.
Yeah, I think there is, as devastating as the result was, there are some things we can look at that give us a bit of optimism. I mean, 6 million people, over 6 million people did vote for the referendum. There's about 50 to 60,000 people in the Yes campaign, which is one of Australia's largest ever social movements. You know, the experiences I had during the referendum were some real highs. I mean, going to that rally in Naarm in September, there was 60,000 people, and looking down Swanston Street, you couldn't see the end of it. You know, speaking at an event in Wonthaggi where we had 400 people turn up, and there's only 5,000 people that live in Wonthaggi. So there was some really interesting, exciting, you know, I spoke to a lot of school groups, and there was some really engaged kids who were passionate. On the other hand, I spoke to some nursing home places, and they weren't quite so supportive, but there were some shocking comments coming out of those groups. But interesting enough, I also spoke to university third age groups, and they were really supportive. So to me, it's not the demographic of old people, it's the demographic of old people who aren't educated. The education is the key. Those university third age were so so supportive because they actually were interested and engaged in education. I had my dad, 83, who was going out door knocking for the Yes campaign. So, I'm not trying to tarnish all old people, but certainly there was a lot of optimism in the younger age groups, which I always wish we could have cut off the referendum at a certain age and lowered the age group to 16 or something like that. We might have had more luck. But so there's a lot of positives out of that. But I think what we've got to be really careful in the reconciliation movement is not let go of that momentum. So back in 2000, you had 1 million Australians walking across bridges. You had 250,000 alone in Sydney. And so there's enormous support in that time. But the strong focus then was to get the government to apologise. Howard refused to apologise. The momentum started to get lost. You had the Tampa vote issue. You had John Howard's specific solution being announced, and all that momentum for reconciliation, for truth-telling, a lot of that disappeared for the next few years. And so we don't want to make that mistake here. I think we've got to find ways to galvanise that support. I know in Reconciliation Victoria and all the other state and territory reconciliation organisations, there's been a lot of interest from members of the community to engage. At RecVic, we're setting up new local groups, because having local reconciliation groups is so important, because you start to get local community members involved in truth-telling and reconciliation activities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together at that local level. I think that's really critical, because also in the regions we saw very much an example of why we need those groups, because I think if you saw that data analysis of individual polling booths, the further you went out from CBDs, the less support you got from the referendum. So as you got into the regions, you had very low levels of support for the referendum. The proviso on that, of course, is when you looked at Indigenous polling booths in remote communities, there was very strong support, and put an absolute clarity to the lie from the no camp that Indigenous people didn't support the referendum. The individual data showed clearly how strong the support was. But apart from Indigenous people, rural and remote Australians very much opposed. So to get those local reconciliation groups to look at local issues is really important. So I think those of us in reconciliation roles, I think, need to look at ways to help keep that momentum going. But Barry's completely right. I think having that sort of individual, focus on what individual acts people can do, continue to educate. I think one of the things I was a bit surprised at in the referendum, I suppose, I spoke to a lot of Yes 23 campaigners and addressed some of their meetings. And whilst they were all passionately supportive of the Voice, which is great, a lot of them didn't have much knowledge on the Voice. And I think, I don't doubt their sincerity and their commitment, but I think all of us non-Indigenous allies keep needing to educate ourselves and to learn. Because I think, we're all in a learning stage. So I think that's important to know as well. We're all products of a really failed Western education system. So I think that continual learning and that humility, non-Indigenous people need to be humble about what we don't know and what we need to learn from. I think that's all incredibly important as well. But I think there is scope for optimism, and there is a large group of Australians who definitely are supportive. They just have to find ways to galvanise that support in really productive ways.
It's been an incredible journey listening to both of you, and it's just such an honour to hear both your deep commitments and reflections on where we are today as a result. And there is hope for the future. And I can't thank you both enough for your incredible time and energy. And here at the Australian Sociological Association of Australia, we're so proud and honoured to have you both. And we will do everything that we can. And what I'm hoping is all the members out there who are listening in universities to really reflect deeply and consider, going back to your departments, and do we have, can we get more Indigenous academics in? Could we support students? How can we support students in those spaces to feel safe and encourage ongoing research? And how can we build the bridge and take what's happened and build that? And as you both have mentioned about the resources, how can we empower that? And both of you have lots of great resources, which we'll put onto the links, and to reach out, so to build and build and build. And the whole thing is that for people who are listening today, if you could please maybe reach out to both the professors if you have ideas on ways to support, whether it be from different funding opportunities, where there can be programs that you think can be assist the community. It's all about building capacity, community capacity, and working together. We are a country that has so many resources out there. You know, we should all work together and see how this, and I'm positive, maybe not my generation, but the next generation, that will never forget the stolen generation, never forget what's happened in the past, but we need to learn from the past. And thank you so much for both of you for spending some of your valuable time and being here today.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, Barry.
Pleasure. Thanks again to both of you.
Thanks, both. Thanks.